Hello and welcome to the Make It Conscious podcast. This is episode 6, and in this episode we're going to be talking about narcissism, following on from the previous episode where I talked about cults and looked at exploitative groups from a psychospiritual perspective. I'm going to be doing a similar thing today and examining the phenomenon of narcissism from a psychospiritual perspective. So this is going to be an overview. We're going to go quite deep. We're going to cover a fair bit of ground though, and see what we can cover off in an hour or so. It's not the last word on narcissism, but I do want to get to the principles of narcissism, what I consider to be the real causes of this phenomena, not merely looking at it from the perspective of, well, would it qualify under the DSM? What does it look like? You know, the lack of empathy and this sort of thing. That's all good and well. But to really integrate what we want to integrate here and develop spiritually ourselves, we really want to understand what's really going on at the heart of narcissism. Let's make sense of this phenomenon beyond simply knowing what it looks like. Because in much the same way as exploitative cults have morphed and changed and adapted over the years, narcissists as well, and abusers and psychological manipulators, they're reading the literature just as much as the next person, right? So if we want to really navigate this phenomenon and protect ourselves from exploitation and abuse from such people, then we will not understand what's driving it. It's no good just to look for the signs, because more often than not, someone who is not practicing empathy or does not have compassion, does not have your best interests at heart, is working overtime to look precisely the opposite. So if we're just looking for the superficial signs, we're not going to get very far. We need to understand really what is driving this at its core. So this episode is called Making Sense of Narcissism. And so in this episode, we're going to be examining narcissism from a psychospiritual perspective. But just to kick us off here, I want to start off with something really important. And this may even be the one thing you might want to take away from this particular episode. And that is that narcissism is not a judgment. It is an observable phenomenon. And I think the challenges that most people face when encountering this kind of behavior in the world is addressed by this statement. Because it's almost invariably our reluctance to judge, right, or be seen as judging, that prevents us from actually seeing things as they are. Now, there's a middle way here, right? On one extreme, we have what we might call judging, okay? So pushing someone away, pushing certain characteristics away in others that we're not conscious of in ourselves and that we disidentify from in ourselves. That would be one extreme. The other extreme would be to never make any decisions, right? Never discern, never allow ourselves to see clearly, give everyone a green light, no matter what they're doing, for fear of being judgmental, right? Now, of course, neither of those extremes is conducive to spiritual growth in the end. And if you follow anyone to an extreme, it will ultimately create a conflict which will play out in the world and force you to integrate something, to make something conscious and to learn something. But it's a very difficult middle way to navigate this. And if you ask 100 people, what is the difference between judgment and discernment? How many of those people can give you a nuanced answer to that question and actually explain what's going on here? Observing a phenomenon does not mean you are judging. The problem with judging is, as I said, disidentifying, pushing away, but also fixing that thing or that person in your mind, saying they are like this or they are this and they will always be this. Of course, that's not true reality, right? Because reality is always changing. And also by fixing them in your mind, it's also discouraging to that person to actually change themselves. right? If we actually label someone as anything, we are essentially inviting them to continue behaving that way. So if they don't have the strength of character, they are more likely to continue in that vein. This is why it's not good practice to judge your children, for example, and say, you bad kid, because they're likely to actually buy into your reality in doing that. So discernment is very different. Discernment is understanding the drivers of what is going on. So even though we might understand that a person is a narcissist, we might say they are a narcissist, probably not to them, I wouldn't advise that. But even if just to our own mind, we might understand that they are behaving in accordance with this condition. And we can do that understanding that they're probably never going to stop behaving in that way. For example, my DNA is not going to change as I age. It'll change, but not much, right? I'm always going to have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome in every cell in my body. That Y chromosome is not suddenly going to become an X chromosome. And in a kind of similar way, for someone who has set their stall out to not transform, to clutch onto a persona of sorts and never let it go because the feelings behind it are so strong that they would rather die, well, it may just be that they have to die before that persona is let go of. So walking this line between discernment and judgment, or rather finding discernment between the extremes of judgment on one hand and just a complete green light to everyone on the other, that's the skill here. And it's not an easy place to find, because as a human, for the vast majority of humans right now, we want quick fixes and one-size-fits-all answers. But spiritual growth, individuation, requires that we find a transcendent middle way. So that sort of encapsulates the problem and the solution, in my opinion. We're going to delve into it in a bit more detail now. Let's look at what a narcissist actually is in classical terms. So in psychology, narcissism is considered as selfishness involving a sense of entitlement, a lack of empathy, and a need for admiration. So these three sort of observable characteristics, if you like. If a person believes they are entitled to everything that they want, or that they need special treatment, that's one thing. A lack of empathy. So in episode 4, I looked at empathy from a psychospiritual perspective, because we consider empathy classically to just be compassion, feeling what other people are feeling. If someone's sad, we feel sad with them. But that doesn't quite get to the heart of it for me. And I examined empathy from a psychospiritual perspective and defined it as a willingness to be transformed by the world. And that's why we feel emotions when other people around us are emotional. We're really feeling something in ourselves and experiencing it through that other person as a mirror. But a narcissist can't do that, because they've decided that not only do they not need to change, but it's best that they don't change, because the moment they allow themselves to be transformed, there's just a dam of unresolved emotion waiting to burst. Like potential energy of emotion just needing to go somewhere. It needs to be continually pushed away. So there you go. Those are the sort of observable features in classic psychology. But in psychoanalysis, narcissism is considered as self-centeredness arising from failure to distinguish the self from external objects, either in very young babies or as a feature of mental disorder. So this is sort of getting closer to the mark. Because if you think there's no empathy, then there's no willingness to be transformed by the world. And therefore, what is the world to someone who is not interested in transforming? The world is then just a selection of tools to be used, right, in order to get them what they want, to be used, to be abused, to keep them comfortable. So that's a bit close to the mark, but again, these are really just looking at what narcissist looks like, but don't really get to the core of it, in my opinion. So I'd like to give you my psychospiritual perspective on narcissism. And by the way, As I mentioned, at the heart of every cult is also a narcissist. So you can use narcissist and cult leader interchangeably here. And whether you're, dealing with someone with these tendencies on a one-on-one basis or in a relationship or in a group, this applies all the same. So at its core, a narcissist can be thought of as someone who has developed an immovable persona in response to early childhood conditions, and which must be propped up to defend against deeply repressed feelings of shame. So this is a slightly different take on narcissism than the definitions I just read out. But again, it's full of terms. I want to delve down and define those terms in more detail now. As I mentioned, someone who has developed an immovable persona. So what is a persona? Well, I'm going to talk now about the persona-shadow dynamic. This is a feature of every human being. It's something that we all have to work with as we develop and we grow spiritually. It's not as complicated as it sounds, right? So the persona-shadow dynamic forms in early childhood, and it forms in response to the social pressures to belong and to survive. The shadow represents the repressed aspects of ourselves, which we have unconsciously disidentified from at an early age. And in contrast to that, there is the persona, which is the way we consciously identify and want to present ourselves to the world. So let's use a really simple example. Let's just say that when we were 3, 4, 5 years old, our parents tried to socialize us, right? And it was necessary that they did so because some rules are better than no rules in the early stages, right? Until you understand the rules and therefore where to find the middle, some rules are better than no rules. And so we might have become conditioned to just be really nice, right? Like be well behaved, be well mannered, don't offend anybody. But of course, if we then identify as someone who is nice, who never offends anybody, then we're going to act out to an inordinate degree that tendency to not offend anybody. We're going to then feel responsible for the feelings of those around us, and that isn't the middle way, right? There's no moderation to that, and therefore we end up putting ourselves in jeopardy and open to manipulation and abuse. So inexorably, the shadow, which is the polar opposite of this nice person, right? The shadow is therefore representing everything that's the opposite of being nice, right? Being unkind, being selfish, being cruel, being mean. And when it's not possible to act as the persona anymore, the shadow will inexorably present itself. And because it's not conscious, it will show up in a very unwieldy, uncontrolled, unconscious way. This is a dynamic that we all have to work through. Not everyone has the same persona. I mean, the persona can be anything. Some people grow up needing to be really funny, for example, or really, really spiritual, or really, really ambitious and driven. And they put so much energy into that persona, they don't allow themselves to be any other way. And it doesn't mean that we throw the bad elements into the shadow per se, but anything that remotely looks like the thing we don't want to be. So for example, if we see ourselves as very driven and we don't see ourselves as lazy, we might then not permit ourselves to have the rest that we need because it looks like being lazy. But actually it might be just what we need. It might not be lazy at all, but the ego doesn't want us to do that because it looks like being lazy, and that's not how we identify. So we want to be seen as a persona. We don't want to be seen as the shadow. And if ever we do feel like we're being seen as the shadow, or whenever we see the shadow in other people, we'll start to feel uncomfortable. And sometimes that can even be extreme. We can experience trauma as a result of that. So in the case of a narcissist, the persona is so firmly rooted that they would rather die than let it go. And it's bound by feeling, right? And it's formed at an early age. So in order to let go of the persona and become more whole as a personality, it's necessary for an individual to work through the feelings that originally locked the persona in place. So if there's a lot of shame at the heart of the persona, if we've identified as someone who is really special in some way, a golden child, or in any way just special and good, that we've thrown this shame into the shadow, and we have to then work through and experience that shame to make it conscious and let it run its course. And in doing that, we can bring on board both extremes of the polarity and find the middle and live freely. This is really where freedom starts and ends, right? But if the feeling is so potent that even going near it is just unbearable, then what is a person supposed to do, right? In the case of narcissism, this is why it's essentially a condition that doesn't go away. There's very, very few examples, if any, of a diagnosed narcissist curing themselves of their condition. And in my view, it's because the feelings that would need to be worked through are just so strong, and there's so much investment into the persona, usually including some grandiose fantasy, that it just would be untenable. Life wouldn't be, in the view of that person, probably worth living, because it would just be so painful to go through all of that. They'd rather act out a fantasy and abuse and manipulate the world through any means possible to uphold that fantasy. So I've said much of this already, but the persona can be thought of as the mask a person wears to present themselves to the world, how we want to be seen by others. And that's really important. It's the world acting as a mirror to us, right? And that's why that if we haven't done our shadow work and there's still a persona that's being held onto, which is the case for most adult humans, then what triggers it is when we perceive other people as seeing us as the shadow. And that is what creates the feeling that needs to be worked through as well. So if we encounter our shadow in the world, for example, we look at the feelings that are coming out and we really zone in on them and give them our bare attention. And that is where the work is done. And we all develop a persona in childhood, but as we mature, our psychospiritual evolution requires us to loosen our grip on the persona. So whilst it may have once been useful, right, because some rules are better than none when you're a kid, it becomes highly limiting and problematic in later life. The persona is held in place by unresolved feelings, which have been repressed in response to perceived danger. Becoming whole in ourselves and fulfilling our potential requires that we work through these feelings, release ourselves from the persona, and bring on board all aspects of our consciousness. Completing this work allows us to behave freely in the world, rather than merely act out existing patterns. Where we are locked in by feeling, the unconscious is going to be driving our thought, speech, and actions from that place as a way to not go near the feeling. And so there's no freedom in that. We might think we're acting freely, but actually, we find ourselves falling into the same patterns again and again, and it might take 4 or 5 iterations before you go, hang on a second, this is a bit like the last time I met someone like this, and I behaved in a sort of similar way, and why do I keep coming into these interactions again and again? And it's because there's an unresolved feeling that's trying to become conscious. So in the case of narcissism, the persona is so firmly rooted that they'd rather die than let it go. And there are very logical reasons as to why this might be, given the conditions of their early childhood, where it could well have seemed like a matter of life and death. So if you look into the histories of these people, there's usually some story of abuse or neglect or something, or serious danger of some kind. And for a child, not having love, that's a pretty serious danger. And obviously that's going to leave its mark on a child, right? But if the feelings they experienced or then repressed into the unconscious, if those feelings were of the magnitude that they were warning this person against possible death, then it makes logical sense that they would rather die than actually go near those feelings. And so these feelings are then regulated by a grandiose, shameless, and or perfect persona. And that is why we have narcissism. So the narcissist persona, whilst it looks like, right, on the surface, materially, it looks like precisely what the narcissist needs in order to resolve feelings of guilt and shame. But the persona isn't the real thing. And in eternally acting out who they feel they should be, they cheat on their real selves. The narcissist cannot discern between true connection versus merely manipulating people towards gratifying their self-image, right? Because there's no willingness to be transformed by the world. It's a case of, well, I'm perfect as I am. The world needs to change to suit my ends. I certainly don't need to change. Any change they do pursue will be a case of adaptation and honing their skills at manipulation. It's very different from transformation, right? Of making the unconscious conscious and growing as a person and becoming whole through that process. Very different kind of change. One moves us towards growth, one simply puts up defenses against it. So in taking the latter, that is their ability to manipulate, as their guiding principle, they are willing to go to great lengths of superficiality, deception, and coercion in order to gain what they truly value. So most likely, if you're listening to this, you've probably had at least one encounter with people with this condition and been left rather discombobulated by the experience and probably aghast and outraged at the sheer absurdity of it. And if nothing else, how incapable they seem to be of seeing what to any healthy person would be patently obvious about the sheer immorality of their behavior and unfairness and double standards and the dishonesty and the deception and so on. But much of the narcissist's unusual and unethical behavior can be understood simply as strategies designed to hold off and regulate these unconscious feelings, perpetually preventing them from coming into conscious expression. So, I really hope that by the end of this episode, you'll have the tools to understand, and that understanding really is the best defense, for want of a better word, against this phenomenon. And I do believe that the phenomenon of narcissism is a small piece in a much larger puzzle. It's quite a popular topic. There's a lot about it on YouTube. There's some very successful YouTube channels that talk about narcissism and nothing else. If you go on Quora.com, you go on Medium.com, there's no shortage of people talking about narcissism and sharing their experiences and sharing guidance and even advice to each other. Something big is going on here, right? But in my opinion, it's not merely some interesting topic that we chuck on the pile of other interesting topics and go, oh, that's nice, that's interesting. I think it's very relevant to what is going on in the world today. It's about control dynamics and the master-slave dynamic, and it's ultimately about human growth and potential. So like in my channel, for example, I talk about narcissism and cults, and I talk about control dynamics, but I also talk about spiritual growth and freedom and idealism, right? And making the unconscious conscious and attaining freedom through that process, not merely by building a business or, moving abroad, but by what we do with our minds and the habits we adopt and the way we live in daily life that is conducive to freedom. And the reason for that is that there is no freedom outside of the mind. And these control dynamics that we see in the form of narcissism and exploitative cults, these are a key piece of that whole discussion. Because if you want to be free, you have to understand evil, and you have to understand control, you have to understand pathology. The true sage is a student of evil. And what is evil other than a lack of respect for other people's sovereignty and freedom, right? Now, I don't want to get too esoteric today or too philosophical about the nature of reality, but freedom plays a big part in it, let's just say. Let's go to a quote from Michael Tsarion. He says, Robert Hare, Harvey Checkley, Martha Stout, and other psychiatrists tell us that 1 in 25 people are sociopathic personality types. Other experts think this is a low estimate. They are right. This is because we're talking about full-blown sociopaths. What about the person who is 75% sociopathic? What about the man or woman who is 50% deranged, or 15%? Add them together and we're way beyond a demographic of 1 in 25. Add to these the common or garden varieties of neurotic. Add the full-blown and or borderline multiple personalities, narcissists, obsessives, sadomasochists, paranoics, bipolars, schizophrenics and psychotics, etc. What's left? Now, I love Michael Tsarion. I love his incredible, deep knowledge. And this guy has done probably more reading than anyone else I know. I don't know that for sure, but I would hazard a guess that he's probably read more books than anybody else that I follow. And he has a very direct way of speaking. He likes to call a spade, and he's very impassioned about this point. But I think that we should take note of what he's saying, and the depth of his knowledge, the depth of his, what I perceive to be a spiritual practice. And I think he's essentially giving us a big slap around the face, right? And pouring water in our face and saying, wake up, look at what's going on in the world right now. Look at the way that everyone's glued to their phones, right? The way they're taking photos of gigs rather than actually experiencing them. They're traveling the world just so they can take photos and show their friends and not actually stopping to look at what's going on. Right? We are addicted to this stuff. I don't think it's too extreme to say that our culture is pretty broken right now. It's gone pretty extreme. The pendulum has swung so far in one direction that it does still surprise me sometimes just how unaware of this fact most people still seem to be. And I think it's because a lot of us are just so in it, right? We're so deep in it, and we're acting unconsciously half the time. Most people don't have a spiritual practice. If they do, then the vast majority of the time they leave out vital components of it. They do everything, but they don't practice compassion, for example, which is pointless. You might as well not meditate if you're not going to practice compassion. Or they practice generosity and they try to speak kindly and they practice mindfulness perhaps, but they don't have a meditation practice. So they're not reaching those deep states of concentration, not gaining insight through that process, not bringing it all together in that way. We've completely lost track of what spirituality is. We're pretty lost right now. And I think sometimes it's necessary just to take a step back and just look around and go, what is happening here? Is this really the way we want to go? Is this really conducive to a healthy, functional society in 20 years' time? Right? Everyone thinking that their way is the right way. Thinking that the way they see the world is the way the world more or less is. Completely ignorant of any concept of an unconscious mind. Making their decisions, rationalizing it post hoc, barely stopping to make the link between what they're doing moment to moment, day to day, the choices they're making, what they're doing with their mind, and the way they feel most of the time. Just not paying attention. So maybe we need that kind of wake-up call. In order to understand narcissism and what drives narcissists, from the full-fledged diagnosed narcissistic personality disorder types, all the way down to what Michael Tsarion describes as the 75% sociopathic or the 50% deranged. I probably wouldn't have used that choice of words myself, but there is a continuum here, right? And there is nonetheless a threshold that's crossed beyond which a person becomes a narcissist, but there's narcissistic behavior all the way up that continuum. And it exists in proportion to the unwillingness to face up to unresolved feeling. And so the source of attention, validation, and admiration that is sought through narcissism and narcissistic behavior. This is known as narcissistic supply, and is the prime motivation and currency for a narcissist, their North Star, if you like. Narcissistic supply looks like what the true self really needs. The true self wants to engage in love and empathy. It wants to be vulnerable, and it wants to be transformed by the world, and therefore connect with the world and discover itself through that interaction, through interfacing with the world. But it doesn't really want to do that, right? Well, the true self does, but the ego doesn't. So we have a conflict. So what does the ego do? It seeks out attention, validation, and admiration as a way to placate that conflict. Because it kind of looks like love, right? It kind of looks like empathy. It looks like connection. But this narcissistic supply is merely a symbol of these qualities, because the narcissist is not willing to actually transform. And for this reason, narcissistic supply cannot provide lasting relief, and it must be constantly maintained. So a lot of the unusual and unethical behavior of narcissists, which can leave one completely bewildered if not understood, it can be explained more or less by this pursuit of narcissistic supply. This is really the currency for a narcissist, and usually explains either directly or indirectly their peculiar behavior and their inconsistency and so on. So to the end of understanding narcissism, let's talk about the narcissist's MO, their modus operandi. And in simple terms, I think it can be reduced to pretty much two basic rules. Like if you were to program like a narcissist chatbot, okay, there'd be two very simple lines of code. And they would go roughly something like: 1, obtain supply. Get narcissistic supply by any means possible, as long as you don't damage your self-image in the process, or die, or get arrested and sent to jail. Now, these are practical considerations, because if you get sent to jail, it's going to be much harder for you to obtain narcissistic supply, right? So obtain attention, validation, and admiration, whatever looks like it, by any means. And the second line of code would be project and defend. Project and defend, project and defend. That's it, right? Because if unconsciously the self, which includes the entire psyche, conscious and unconscious, it knows that there's a lot of pain, right? It knows that there's a lot of shame, and it knows that really the ego is the one that wants the attention, right? Well, it wants to be seen as very kind and big-hearted or spiritually evolved, say perhaps in the case of a spiritual cult leader. It wants to be seen a certain way. Maybe it wants to be seen as the second coming of Christ, right? Take an extreme example, which was the case for the cult that I left a couple of years ago. I'll talk more about that in the previous episode. Any hints of imperfection or accusation, if you just project that onto the other person, spin it around somehow, and make out that they're the one who is being dishonest or is not understanding something, then it placates the ego, and it makes the ego feel better, because it temporarily diminishes that conflict between the ego and the self. Like taking paracetamol for that tension doesn't actually solve the problem. It just manages the pain temporarily. But, you know, if you're taking paracetamol every day, you're going to do yourself some damage, most likely, if you're taking a lot of it. In much the same way, by constantly seeking out narcissistic supply, the narcissist does a lot of damage to themselves and to the world. And so also here, as well as project, is to defend. So that means that any time those painful feelings just start to rise above the surface, even slightly, just defend, just defend, just defend. Use projection, of course, but use sublimation, rationalization, whatever it takes to not go near those feelings. So there you go. In a nutshell, the Narcissist MO, 1, obtain supply, and 2, project and defend. And if you can take on board those basic principles, I think you'll find spotting narcissistic tendencies much easier. And I think it's important because often I think, in line with what I said in the last episode about what attracts people to exploitative situations, especially cults, often it's that we don't allow ourselves to see the red flags, right? It's not that there's some genius deception campaign going on. If we actually aren't willing to see the red flags, then the deception campaign doesn't need to be very sophisticated. We'll buy into any hook, any little attempt to pull the wool over our eyes. We're actually kind of complicit in that interaction. And so in really overcoming this dynamic and narcissism in society, it's not really sufficient that we just demonize narcissists. This is one way in which my content is a little bit different perhaps from the majority of what else you see out there. I'm a big proponent of shadow work and Jungian psychology, really understanding how we bring these dynamics around ourselves, how we actually invite them in. It's about understanding, yes, like there is cruel and unwholesome behavior going on, and that is true, and we're not excusing that, but it's also about understanding how on some level our mind is bringing this about. If you're familiar with my 7 habits of individuation, habit 1 is to take responsibility for your mind. But it's more than that. It's also about understanding how our mind actually brings these situations about. If there's something that we need to make conscious as part of our own psychospiritual development, our mind will find a way to conspire with the world to make that situation that brings it out of us arise. And once we make that conscious, the problem will be resolved. But I think one reason that there is such a preponderance of narcissism in society right now may well be because there is a mass need for integration in our culture of this particular quality of mind, and understanding where to draw that line between judgment on one hand and being completely undiscerning on the other. So I want to delve a bit deeper now into another tactic that is a common strategy of psychological abusers, including narcissists, sure, but also cults and corporate organizations, and at an even larger scale, governments as well often do this. And that strategy is known as Darvo. And Darvo is an acronym. It stands for 1, deny, 2, attack/accuse, and 3, reverse roles of victim and offender. So, for example, when a psychological abuser is called out on their unwholesome behavior or their cruelty or their lack of compassion, whatever it is, the first port of call would be to deny, like, well, I didn't do that, or to spin it around somehow, try to make out that it was actually maybe for your own good, it was justified in some way. And secondly would be to attack and to accuse, usually in the form of projection. So actually like, well, it wasn't me that did that, it was actually you that did that, and see, you're doing it now, you're actually attacking me right now for saying this thing. And lastly, to then reverse the role of victim and offender. So not only are you doing that, but I'm actually now the victim here, and you're this offender, a psychological abuser. So it flips the whole thing around. And I can actually give an example of this from when I left the Buddhist cult a couple of years ago. During one of the classes, the teacher, as it were, was reading out some Buddhist scripture, which he completely misinterpreted. And it was unequivocal. It was a case of, he literally got it backwards. And I privately followed up with him after the class and said, hey, I think I was actually correct in my thinking here, and that you did actually get this thing backwards in the wrong sequence. It's actually meant to be the other way around. That's how the Buddha originally intended it. And he actually denied that, claimed to understand it perfectly, said that it merely wasn't clear, but then actually flipped it around and said that when I had given a course that it wasn't clear. And when I then ultimately, as a result of many things, including that, I said, this isn't the place for me anymore. I'm going to leave. He reversed the role of victim and offender and actually made a public announcement saying that he had decided to let me go rather than it actually being my decision to leave. So he made some very slanderous posts about what happened, deliberately tried to damage my reputation, saying things that weren't true. And so that's an example of Darvo. So someone who is practicing a spiritual path, such as the 7 habits of individuation, doesn't need to use Darvo. There is no reason to do it. In fact, for someone walking the path of the sage, if ever someone comes to them and says, hey, I wasn't happy about something you did, or what you did was harmful to me, that person is going to meet with that and face it head on, and they're going to take it on board, and they're going to understand. They're not necessarily going to 100% agree. There might be other reasons why this person has said that, right? It might just be an accusation. They're going to take it on board, though. They're going to reflect on it. They're not interested in just defending a persona indefinitely, right? They're not interested in just hanging on to that as a strategy for navigating life. They understand that the best and only strategy for navigating life is to make the unconscious conscious. It's ultimately to work towards letting go of that persona and any other psychological quality or behavioral pattern or anything that limits us. So if someone's coming to them from, or with rather, some kind of concern or criticism or feedback, they're going to take it on board because they know that no matter what, there's something in that for their own mind to work with. Whether they agree or not, there's something in it, there's a reason that's showing up for them. They're not interested in merely adapting and becoming more effective at deflecting accusations. So for someone who's ever made the fatal error of getting close to a narcissist, whether it's a romantic partner, a business partner, or a spiritual teacher, or even a friend or a family member, or an employer, you may have experienced what is technically known as narcissistic rage. So when faced with the reality of losing a significant source of narcissistic supply, or having the persona or the self-image threatened, this can tip a narcissist over into narcissistic rage. So unwilling to experience empathy, so unwilling to be transformed by the world and the experience, they display a level of vindictiveness, the likes of which most people have never encountered. So, you may have experienced this with a narcissist who has maybe for years, right, had this affable persona, and you may have become, or felt that you became quite close to this person. And maybe that you projected your own inner numinous material onto this person, not least the mother and the father, right? These qualities and these archetypes that are contained within us, but are projected out onto the real world, often with our biological parents, of course, but not just that with them. And we might be doing this without us even realizing it. But maybe also things like the sage, the hero, the Christ archetype, right, as may well happen in a spiritual relationship. And we may have come to believe that this person was really compassionate, right, and really cared about other people in the world around them. So for them to suddenly, at the drop of a hat, the moment they realize that you're no longer in their control, like a flick of a switch, out comes the narcissistic rage. Suddenly, they're pushing all these buttons, they're taking all these actions, whether physical, whether attacking perhaps, maybe extreme passive aggression, executing on legal contracts, blocking accounts, blocking your access to certain things, launching a campaign of slander through your mutual network, working through suppliers of your business, trying to turn them against you or stop working with you, pulling all the emotional strings they know how to pull, projecting, defending, Darvo, accusing you of everything that they themselves are doing, stealing, all of these things. It can be quite discombobulating to say the least, to see someone who you may have known for several months or even years flip in a mere instant from this apparently kind, compassionate person into an absolute demon. Because you, having previously been reliable supply for suppressing their trauma, now become the sole object of its projection. You are the thing that is threatening them with their unresolved emotion. They see you as the problem. You're perceived as a critical problem that must be eliminated as a matter of life and death, because you have threatened their persona. And as far as their ego is concerned, if you don't exist, or if you come to harm, if you experience all the things that they don't want to experience, then they can safely placate that very content in themselves. And this also is where they tend to trip themselves up and make a lot of mistakes. It's often easy in these dynamics to, if we have been so complicit for so long, and we maybe aren't as willing to flip in the same way that a narcissist is, we might be tempted to think that they don't make so many mistakes because we haven't been willing to see the mistakes up until this point. But actually, if we allow ourselves to see them, they make mistakes all the time. And not least in this situation where they're exhibiting narcissistic rage, because it is at this point when they will tend to project everything that they themselves are pushing away. The ego, the jealousy, the lack of understanding, the hostility. If you actually listen, they'll tell you everything that's going on inside their own mind, if that's something we're willing to see. So assuming they don't commit outright murder, it is only the risks to themselves and their self-image that actually prevent them from going to this extreme, rather than any sense of empathy or morality. You can see this in simply the fact that they were able to flip and put on a different mask so quickly is proof that there was never really any concern for you or your well-being. It was purely exploitation. It was using you to generate narcissistic supply, most likely directly, and perhaps also as a tool for obtaining more and more reliable supply. So it's at this point where you're likely to experience a lot of projection withdrawal. That is where whatever you've been projecting onto this person, whether it's your anima, animus, mother, father, hero, sage, they're no longer meeting that image, right? They're no longer trying to meet that image, most likely. And so you feel like you're no longer engaging with this inner aspect of yourself. It's like it's been lost. And so you'll feel incomplete. It can be very difficult. But a large part of the reason why we didn't see the red flags up until this point, we didn't notice all the mistakes, was because we didn't allow ourselves to, because we projected this archetype, which is perfect, right? It's inherently ideal. It doesn't even exist out there. It doesn't even exist as anything that can be imperfect. It's a perfect thing that we project onto an imperfect world. And so therefore the world can never meet that projection permanently. It only serve as a way for us to realize and integrate that content within ourselves. That's also why these kinds of betrayals, these experiences are, not only valuable for spiritual growth, but maybe even necessary. This may actually be a rite of passage that each person has to go through in their own path to wholeness and freedom. In fact, I also talk about this during what's known as the clash phase of cult codependency. So if you've read my ebook, you can read all about that. If you haven't, check it out at makeitconscious.com/free guide. And in there, I talk about the 5 phases of cult codependency. And it also applies to narcissistic relationships as well. And the 4th phase is what I call the clash phase. And that is where you're likely to see narcissistic rage. Beyond that, you might be likely to see something called hoovering. So another important concept to understand here, and something you can absolutely expect when you break away from a narcissist or a cult leader, and that is hoovering. So this is when a narcissist struggling with the loss of supply tries to get your attention, force engagement, or draw you back in after the relationship has ended. So this can take many forms, right? Text messages, liking your old posts, trying to force you into interactions through setting up fake meetups, right? Trying to get other people to invite you out to an event somewhere and not tell you that they're going to be there. And so trying to organize like a sort of a coincidental meetup, for example. The thing is though, even if they don't genuinely believe they can successfully re-recruit you as supply, they do nonetheless get some temporary relief simply from forcing themselves into your field of attention and knowing that they are on your radar. So it's important to remember what's driving all of this, right? And again, it's that need for narcissistic supply. It's that craving for what looks like love and connection, but is really just an impoverished substitute for it in the form of attention, validation, and so on. So when they're struggling with that loss of supply, it's either go near the feelings I don't want to go near, or force myself back into the field of attention of someone and just try and get that interaction, try and get that attention again. So you can expect narcissists, cult leaders, and cult members working on their behalf to try and hoover you through various means. And this might happen several times, and it's likely to slowly dwindle over time. I'm not here to give advice or say what you should do in the face of hoovering, but if you understand what's driving it, then it might be worth considering just ignoring it and allowing it to diminish, because if you entertain it in any way at all, even if it's a way that appears to be really laying on the line, explaining your point of view, explaining why you're not interested in being in contact, it's unlikely to actually work with a narcissist, because they're just going to twist it, misrepresent it, claim that you meant something else. And really what they're trying to do is they're trying to tempt you in to responding again. They want you to want to correct them, right? To get them to understand. I think once someone has revealed themselves as communicating in a deceptive way like that, there's very little to be gained from continuing that conversation. Better to just accept that there are people who don't see things the way you see them and actually are deliberately deluding themselves into seeing the world in a way that is comfortable to them, but refusing to actually interface with reality as it is. So there may be a case, however, for actually maybe the one time actually explaining your decision to leave. I think there's a case for resolving it in oneself, but letting go of the need to actually convince other people, especially a narcissist, as to agreeing with that explanation. They don't need to agree with it, but in line with the 7 habits of individuation, right, and habit 3, which is skillful communication, I would recommend that if you need to say something, you do that, and you do that early. You do that at the point at which you leave, and then there's no need to say any more. If they really want to understand, they can just go and look at your old messages, right? If they're still asking questions that suggest they haven't really taken that on board, don't feel you have to explain it again. You've already explained it. But what I'm not necessarily suggesting here is ghosting, right? No contact without explanation. Not least because that could just create more conflict in your own mind that leads to a similar situation arising again in the future. Best to resolve it in yourself and allow other people to resolve it in themselves. It's often stated in the classic definitions of narcissism that there is this lack of empathy, right? And this harks back to what I said at the start, and also episode 4, where I talked about empathy from a psychospiritual perspective. So I just want to revisit that briefly now. Empathy can be thought of at its core as the willingness to consciously transform and be transformed by the world around you. So this shows up in the form of experiencing what other people appear to be experiencing, feeling their emotions, being sad when our friends are sad. But is it really that we are experiencing their feelings, or are we experiencing our own feelings with them as the mirror for something unresolved in ourselves? Now, in the context of narcissism, they lack empathy because they're not willing to be transformed by the world. So it's not that there's just a sort of assortment of disparate characteristics, like there's the lack of empathy, there's the rigid persona, and there's all this suspect behavior and deception and so on. At its core, it's that actually there's an unwillingness to be transformed, because the moment they show any vulnerability, that preponderance of unresolved feeling is just going to come crashing down, right? And it's going to be very painful, and they don't want to go there. So really what's going on is that they're shutting down from engaging with the world in any way. And therefore the world has to adapt, as far as they're concerned, to what it is that they need. And that is why they lack empathy, and that is why they don't experience other people's feelings, because they're not experiencing their own feelings. So what can look like a posture of confidence is actually a defense. And as a person walks this spiritual path and chooses to pursue the process of individuation, they start to realize that things aren't merely not what they purport to be in life, but are often the precise opposite of what they purport to be, by virtue of trying to compensate for a polarity. You can learn a lot about the world and about people by observing this quirk of human existence and reality, right? Generally speaking, remembering the persona shadow dynamic, the way people like to present themselves is often hiding its precise opposite. And so what looks like confidence in a narcissist is actually a defense against being seen as unconfident, shameful, whatever it is that's in opposition to that persona. So now to a quote from Carl Jung. It wouldn't be a Make It Conscious podcast without some Jung thrown in there. So he says, an inflated consciousness is always egocentric and conscious of nothing but its own existence. It is incapable of learning from the past, incapable of understanding contemporary events, and incapable of drawing right conclusions about the future. This consciousness is hypnotized by itself and therefore cannot be argued with. It inevitably dooms itself to calamities that must strike it dead. Paradoxically enough, inflation is a regression of consciousness into unconsciousness. This always happens when consciousness takes too many unconscious contents upon itself and loses the faculty of discrimination, the sine qua non of all consciousness. So like in the case of narcissism, perhaps someone is over-identifying with one of the major archetypes, maybe the sage, maybe Christ, right? And, there's how many Christ claimants in the world now? If you go to Wikipedia, there's like a whole page devoted to who thought they were Jesus from every century going back until, the 1st century. So clearly this is a phenomenon that's occurring time and time again. And the great irony is that rather than it being a reflection of an increased consciousness, this over-identification with this archetype, it's actually a step away from consciousness. It's actually impairing a person's ability to discriminate and differentiate between the various objects of the world and what's going on inside themselves. So hence it's incapable of drawing right conclusions about the future. It's likely to make spurious predictions which, to quote Sam Harris, lead to embarrassment right on schedule, and yet somehow fail to learn from such instances repeatedly. And so inflated consciousness is always egocentric. It is what there is. It believes it is the only thing that's important because it's not willing to interface with the world. So, as I have alluded to, I think the phenomenon of narcissism is an important consideration in this much larger unfolding of cultural evolution. And it exists at 3 scales in my mind. On an individual level, in codependent and abusive relationships, in organizations, any group of any size, cults, cult leaders, families, organizations, companies, and at a societal level, in governments and authorities. You could certainly make the case that certain forms of government control are a kind of psychological abuse, and that actually they exist for the benefit of those same organizations. Whereas in principle, a government should be there to exist for the good of the country as a whole and the people in that country. In practice, it's becoming more and more abundantly clear that many governments around the world are essentially just operating much like a business and are in cahoots with businesses around the world to perform for their mutual benefit, not for the benefit of people as on the whole. It's for the benefit of those organizations. And in doing so, really falling in love with the prestige and the symbol of what they think they need, materiality, profit, economic growth, whatever it may be. Now, those financial metrics, they're not a problem. They're not bad. There's nothing wrong with trying to make profit. But if any organization, including government, is trying to chase these metrics of economic growth or whatever it is, as though it was a perfect surrogate for what they really need, they're going to cause inordinate amounts of externalities and problems for themselves and other people, which is exactly what's happening. So, in a sense, it's not much different than a solo narcissist chasing attention and validation when what they really need is empathy and connection, the real thing. And, clearly there is a huge anti-narcissism movement in the world today. And this is totally understandable in pushback to the preposterous levels of narcissism that we see in our culture today. And there is a huge sense of people just having had enough of this abuse from their ex-partners, their husbands, their wives, the head of their church, their employers, right? Maybe one or both parents. Is this the beginning of a cultural revolution? I do wonder if one of the reasons that we're seeing both sides of this dynamic is because there is a huge lesson that needs to be learned by people en masse that can be found in this precise dynamic. And it comes down to walking that middle way between judgment on one hand and being completely undiscerning on the other. And as our culture develops, becomes more global, or more integrated globally, having one-size-fits-all rules simply won't work. The only way forward would be for everybody to move towards sovereignty in themselves and come to be able to find the middle way around such things themselves. What's not going to work, and what isn't working, because people are trying it, is to just mandate that we all be nice to each other. Make posters that look nice, put them on the bus, and tell people to be kind, right? Because maybe those people don't understand the benefits of being kind. Maybe we need to tell them that being kind is what they really should be doing. Wouldn't it be wonderful if it was possible to fix the world in that way? But the level of consciousness development in society is stratified. There are people at all stages. And if you go to someone who has, barely left a ravaged, war-torn country where they barely had any food and has moved to London or has moved to Berlin or wherever, and you tell them to just be nice to people, they're just going to take advantage of you, most likely, right? It depends. Not everybody, obviously, but if they haven't moved to the next stage they need to move to, and you're up here telling them to just be nice to each other, it's not going to work. It's not an integrated approach. If you tell them that, it's wrong to judge, they might get the wrong end of the stick there and think that means just being completely undiscerning, letting everyone into your life, having no boundaries on how we're willing to be treated by others. That's when we start welcoming psychological manipulators into our lives. And so, as much as the anti-narcissism movement is a positive sign in some ways, it's providing a lot of education around this topic, which is essential in overcoming it, but it can go too far. And what I'm saying here is that merely demonizing narcissists isn't actually a full cure for this problem. It negates the fact that these people show up in our lives for a purpose, and that there's something we need to integrate in ourselves that when we do so will actually genuinely cure this problem for us. If we don't, we're just going to keep encountering these people until we're forced to bring that aspect on board. So, shadow work is really important. Understanding how we came into this situation in the first place, understanding what it was that really triggers us about this person, and understanding what we can actually integrate in ourselves so that we can continue to walk that middle way, right? Neither being judgmental, shutting ourselves down from not just relationships with narcissists, but with all people and strangers, and becoming a misanthrope. That's not going to solve the problem. But likewise, being completely undiscerning and just opening the floodgates to anyone and anything and any kind of behavior, even if it's not ill-intentioned but is nonetheless unskillful or unhelpful or harmful to us, that's not going to take us anywhere. So wouldn't it be nice if we had a one-size-fits-all answer to this problem? But individuation isn't like that. There's a middle way to be found here. Where is that middle? That's for you to find. That is what the journey is about. And I hope that by sharing these principles and these concepts, that is precisely what this enables you to do. It's not about, getting out your checklist and going narcissist spotting. It's about really understanding what empathy is, what a narcissist is, what an exploitative cult is. And therefore, when it shows up in some new, idiosyncratic, never before seen form, you can still say, I know what that is. That's a lack of empathy. That's a person who is not willing to be transformed by the world. And as nice as they appear, saying all the right things and saying it all in the right way, there's a little something there which suggests they're not actually willing to engage in true connection and to be transformed by the world. So how would it therefore be possible that this person has my best interests at heart? So these principles can help you to see that sort of thing in whatever form it takes. Now to a comment from YouTube that's by a guy called Mike. So shout out to you, Mike, whoever and wherever you are. Mike says, they are successful because people are not aware. It's easy to win a game that nobody else is playing. That's exactly right. So I'm not suggesting that anyone go and play this game. I'm suggesting that people understand what it involves and therefore to spot when other people are playing this game. It's not that narcissists are especially intelligent or more skillful than other people. They're just not concerned about their impact on other people and are willing to manipulate them to obtain that narcissistic supply, even if that means deception and so on. So they're playing a game, and good-hearted people are projecting their own goodness onto these narcissists and not aware that they're actually doing it. If you understand the game, you can see it being played and you don't have to partake in it. And you certainly won't be taken in by it. It really is that simple. Education is the cure, as well as shadow work, of course. So we're going to end here by reading a quote by Jungian analyst and author Murray Stein. It's about betrayal. He says, betrayal shatters the precious and often sacrosanct images a person has lived by, hoped in, found guidance from, and trusted. The idealized transference object is broken, and another reality is presented, a reality that shows the shadow beside the persona, the depths of pathology in the human condition alongside its nobility and glory, the destructive element in God beside the creative, the hateful beside the loving. It's a hard vision to bear, but it is the only way to go from betrayal towards wisdom and to further life. Very powerful quote, and I think he's touching on something very relevant to what I've been discussing here today. And this idea that as much as an encounter with a narcissist can be very damaging and can be awful, can feel so painful, not least in the physical difficulty of it and the financial trouble perhaps and the legal trouble, but in the harsh projection withdrawal. Like, we thought this person was something that they weren't. We idealized them in whatever form that took. And to have that image so cruelly smashed and broken, and that actually that may be one of the most powerful experiences, for integrating that very archetype into ourselves. And so once we've done that, we no longer need to project that onto another person again. If we've worked through the feeling, then we've integrated it and we no longer need to do it. If we've not worked through the feeling, then we're likely just to keep repeating that pattern. So I'll leave that there, guys. I hope that's been useful, and I shall chat to you next time.